Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Creation Conversations for this week. Back to our previous slot of 9 p.m. on a UK time. So, welcome to wherever you're joining us from. This evening, we've got with Joe Hubbard is in the US with Glenn Wilson over there in Tennessee, I believe, and then we've got Craig Hawkins and Diane Eager from Australia joining us. Well, Craig's from Tasmania, I must mention that, but still Australia. So welcome this evening. We've got an interesting program for you. We are going to be looking at some creationist stroke evolutionist predictions, what we expect to see if creation's true or if evolution was true. So welcome to the program this evening. And as we kick off, Joe's going to just explain that a bit, what we're going to be looking at, and then each of our guys that are on the call here, the experts that we have, will be sharing some of those things. And do get your questions in. Welcome to those that are joining us. We've got a few watchers at the moment, so welcome. And get your questions in if you've got any questions as we go, and we'll bring those up a bit later in the show. So over to Joe.
Thanks, Steve. And just a quick mention as well to continue to pray for our director, John Mackay, who's not here with us today, mainly because there was a very large tropical cyclone that passed through Queensland, and it's sort of produced a lot of havoc. Thankfully, John's house and garden and everything is safe, which is wonderful, and John himself is safe, but no electricity, although we believe it has possibly come back on. But anyway, keep him in prayers as he tries to sort through everything there. The topic today is one of creationist predictions, and it's really twofold. The first sort of side of it is something that our critics use, or attempt to use rather, against creation quite a lot. And we'll talk a bit about that. And the second thing is something that we actually use quite a lot. So what are the two sides? Well, when it comes to predicting things in science, many people have this sort of gotcha kind of attitude against creation because they say, can you name any predictions that creationists have made in science that have proven to come true? Well, the simple answer to that is yes and no, which is probably more complex than what you wanted. But you see, yes, there are many times that creationists have done science and made predictions in science based on their creationist beliefs. In fact, you can say the same thing in things like mining, right? Predictions of where coal and where gold will be based on a belief in Noah's flood, and they have been proven to be correct. So yes, the argument is already looking a bit fragile from the evolutionists, the critic side of things, but it actually comes from a place that, well, it's not necessarily a full understanding of how science actually works. No scientist sits around in his office all day, or I should say no scientist should sit around in his office all day going, I predict this, and then go and try and prove it. You see, when you do science experiments, the way that you work in science, and this is taught from, 7th grade kind of thing all the way up, is that you make a hypothesis, an educated guess. In other words, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not just an idea that's popping out of thin air. It's actually based off of pre-knowledge and preconceived observations. And when you create a hypothesis, you don't just create one hypothesis. It's not an idea about what you think is going to happen. You make a hypothesis about what you think is going to happen, and you make something called a null hypothesis. In other words, in science, you're very little trying to sort of prove something to be true. That's not the way that science works. You're making observations, you're doing tests, you're doing experiments in order to show either the hypothesis or the null hypothesis to be a factual statement. In other words, you get two opposite ends, right? And you do your best to try and disprove both of them. And if you disprove one of them and you can't disprove the other, you're well on your way to building a functional model in science. In other words, this idea of unless creationists can make accurate predictions, you can't be doing real science, the whole idea is completely flawed. That's not how science works. However, what we're going to do is two things in this program. Number one, we're going to show you where scientists have made predictions based off of a knowledge of creation or an understanding of creation. In particular, one of the examples that I'm going to use is beliefs about soft tissue, right? And experiments that have been done based on a belief in creation that have shown to be accurate and actually produce results. So these predictions, if you like, the hypotheses that come from a place of of creation-based belief does happen and does happen in science and is done by creation. So we'll get rid of the critics issue. The other issue is actually something that is related, but it's an argument, or if you like, a position that we take a lot in creation. And in fact, it's not just one that we take, we use it in debates and we use it in schools as well. Not that we're trying to debate the students, but it's a really good way of getting students to think. It's asking yourself the question, if creation was true, if Noah's flood was true, if the events that happened in Genesis chapters 1 to 11 are true, then what do you expect to find? In other words, you're thinking through the implications of what happened or what is recorded to have happened in Genesis 1 through 11. That's creation, the fall, Noah's flood, and the Tower of Babel, and thinking, well, if creation has happened, if creation really did happen the way that it says it happened, what do we expect to find? Now, that's a form of making a prediction, and you can go and look at the real world and you can see what you do find. But it's a good starting point to come from when we're dealing with things like creation and Noah's flood and, this kind of science. If creation was true, what would you expect to see in biology? If Noah's flood actually happened, what would you expect to find in geology? If the Tower of Babel really happened, what would you expect to find in people studies, in anthropology, and in genetics? And if the fall really happened and the world has gone from good to bad to worse, what effects would you expect to see all over the planet? So what we're going to do now is we have a group of us, we have a different sort of topic to talk about, which we're going to mention very briefly and start to break our way down. And I think we might as well go straight over to you, Glenn, because you're actually going to do our first section.
That's right. That's right. And I'm going to start off by just showing you just a few objects, and then I'll go to my slide presentation. So if you look at this, it's kind of unusual. You're probably not going to be able to guess as to what it is, because I showed it to Joe the other day. He didn't know what it was. He thought it might be obsidian, but it's glass. But this glass is vitrified soil. I used to work at the Oak Ridge National Lab, and one of the projects that they did was in situ vitrification. It's taking contaminated soil. Now, they weren't testing it with contaminated soil, and melting it into a glass, because it would then be millions of years before any contaminants would be released from it. And of course, it would be much longer before this ever broke down from the glass. I'm going to show you something else. You can look at this. We'll talk about this later, as to think about what that might be. And then show you this. We collected this yesterday, didn't we, Joe?
Mm-hmm.
We were out at a quarry, and just look at all the layers in there. So that's what we're going to talk about seeing. And the question that we're going to address is, what would you expect to find? If evolution's true, well, then the surface should be largely igneous rocks, or the breakdown slowly of this melted soil. Or you would also maybe expect to see evidence of some local sedimentary rocks, some little isolated pockets. But these layers should have buried soils. We're going to talk about that. Whereas if creation's true, what would you expect to find? And that's what we're going to talk about. So what do the observations show? Well, I've been to the Grand Canyon many times. This is a picture I took from floating down it. And the Grand Canyon's got about 1 mile deep of sedimentary rock before you get to the igneous rock down below. But worldwide, what do we see? We see about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock worldwide. And these layers, even this lowest layer at the Grand Canyon, covers all of North America. Now, that's not a local flood. We talked yesterday about the coal seams that go all across this part of the country, from Texas to Canada, and extend all the way over into Europe. And that's not a local flood. Also, with these layers we find oftentimes that are bent or folded. So all of these layers needed to be laid down at one time and folded, bent while they're still soft. And you see these all over the place. The one at the top right, I took not too far from where I live here. But you see these in the Grand Canyon as well. So this shows that all these different layers had to have been laid down at one time. If you had uplift and they were already hardened, you would get them to snap, and you would just have a big fissure there. So these layers, what are the other things they show? They show abrupt boundaries. And, we could postulate as to, well, how do you get these abrupt boundaries in a layer like this, how they could all be laid down by a flood. But Mount St. Helens was a really interesting science for us that showed that you got 600 feet of sediment laid down in 3 hours. And within that, you see all of this fine layering. And yet that's all from one big, massive dump. So secular geologists have said, well, yes, there's these layers that are laid down rapidly, but there's millions of years of missing time between one massive dump and the next one. Well, is that true? If that's true, what would you expect to find? You ought to find something that indicates that there was missing time. Well, one of the things that you would find is what we saw at Mount St. Helens. 16 years after Mount St. Helens deposits, those big deposits at the top had been started to grow grass. The grass dies, the roots die, leaves organic matter on the surface. Roots, you'd expect to find roots. If there's any time at all, plants are going to move in, plants are going to grow, and they're going to have roots. What I showed you earlier was from a desert out in Nevada where there was a tree stump and the roots had rotted away and erosion filled them in with sediment and they just partially cemented. I collected several specimens of that. You could see those root channels filled in with sediment. We don't see that in the layers. We don't see evidence of ant channels or any biotubation. There's no evidence whatsoever of missing time. But if there was any time at all, you would have had a soil profile develop, you would have root channels, and those root channels would fill in with sediment. You'd also find gullies. I've studied gully erosion all over the world. Some of these pictures are from China, some Spain, some from Australia. Everywhere you find gullies, even if there's a good grass cover, even if there's not a real steep slope. Well, those gullies would fill in, and instead of seeing these layers as they are going on for miles, you would see filled in gullies. We don't see any evidence for missing time. So that's basically what I have to say. We'll go to that on the next talk. Is that what observations do we see? Science is making observations. We see evidence that all these layers are laid down at one time and not over millions of years.
Good stuff. And I think that's one of those ones where it's, if creation and Noah's flood was true, what would you expect to find?
Yeah.
And we can do the same thing to carry on actually into a sort of a quick fossily discussion, and then I'll invite others to comment as we go. But what I'm going to talk about now is again that question of what would we expect to find if creation was true, particularly in relation to things like fossils, transitional forms, and that kind of stuff. Well, we had a school that I was speaking at just earlier today, and this is one of the things that I brought up to the students, right? How did God say that he created in Genesis chapter 1? Well, 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, God said that he created things after their own kind. Now, if you want to follow the logic all the way through, Romans chapter 1, verse 20, God has stamped his nature into creation, so mankind is without excuse. Part of God's nature, right, in the book of Malachi, I am the Lord and I do not change. So don't be surprised that he wrote this aspect of his nature into creation 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. It says that God made living things to reproduce after their own kind. Now, there can be an enormous amount of change and variety within a kind. You just have to look at things like dogs, right, to see that. But when it comes to this idea of evolution, this idea that you start down here and build yourself up over millions of years, right, from molecules to man, from monkey to man, and so on and so forth, what would you expect to find? Well, you would certainly expect to find at least a record of it in the fossil record. In fact, fossil record is a rather poor name for it, because you see, it reflects the ideas of Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin, which is that the bottom layer got there first, the top layer got there last. So the fossils are a record of life over millions of years as they slowly evolved onwards and upwards. Now, we can talk about the fact that as to this date, there is not a single undisputed transitional form in the world today. Now, we've done a whole program on transitional fossils, so I'd encourage that you go and watch that, right? And we deal with things like Archaeopteryx, which has been proven by the Natural History Museum in London, a secular institution, to be a fully functioning bird. Now, it's a slightly unusual bird, but it's still a bird. And even things like coelacanth was once considered to be, a transitional form because of its stumpy fins, which are supposed to be on their way to evolving legs into a tetrapod. And then, well, coelacanth turned up live and well, and they're a deep sea creature about as far away from the land as you can possibly get. So they're certainly not. They are, however, a living fossil. Living fossil, yeah, coined by Charles Darwin because he said his theory was all about change. He said, my theory depends not on the animal's ability to survive or the strength, but its ability to adapt to change. In other words, evolution is all about change. But the Bible says, no, creatures reproduce after their own kind. So what would we expect to find? Well, we would expect to find two things. Number one, we'd expect to find that DNA is designed to not evolve. Hey, Diane's going to speak about that next, right? Mm-hmm. But we would also expect to find, if we go in the fossil record, which is a history of animals and creatures that used to be alive, are now dead and have been preserved. So if millions of years is true, then they should be a full record of evolution over those millions of years. What do we find? Well, we find things like this. And I love doing this with kids because you hold it up to them and you say, what is this? Hands fly up around the room. It's some kind of a fossil shrimp, or a prawn, as we would call it in the UK, one of the lobster family. And then you would ask them, you'd say, well done, well done, well done. But here's a really tough question for you. How did you know that it was a shrimp? And they all stop and they scratch their heads. And then one of the brave ones will say, well, it looks a bit like a shrimp. And I'll say, you're right. There's no trick questions here. You knew that this was a shrimp because it looked like a shrimp. It hasn't evolved. And this comes from a rock, by the way, that is supposed to be 155 million years old. Now, what you've just proven is that in 155 million years, shrimp have turned into shrimp. In other words, they haven't evolved at all. Now, you can see a variety of minor changes. You can see a lot of variety within the shrimp kind, but this shrimp here is still a shrimp. It hasn't evolved, and it hasn't evolved in 155 supposed million years, so it's unlikely to evolve anytime soon.
And it looks good enough to eat. It's so detailed.
Well, you might think so. But the other thing, this deposit, by the way, the Solnhofen in Germany, that's also where you get a whole variety of fossils, including abundant living fossils. In fact, Craig even has his fossil dragonfly in Tasmania that we've reported on as it got shipped over there from all over the world. And, well, yeah, that's a living fossil too. It hasn't changed. It hasn't evolved. So that's 155 million years, and there's been no evolution. By the way, you can do that with even older stuff as well. Any ideas what these are? Well, if you thought it was some kind of a starfish or a brittle star, you'd be absolutely right. You hold that right, there we go. There's the modern one right next to it. In fact, after their kind is a really important part of the displays that we do, because they really do show the importance of getting a biblical perspective in all things. What would we expect to find if creation is true? We would expect to find no evidence of large-scale change in the rocks, and if there is any change in the rocks, it would clearly be either diversity within a kind, or it would be good to bad to worse. In other words, creatures going from complex to simple, not the other way around. And what do we find in the fossil record? We always find one of three things. Either creatures remain exactly the same and they don't change in the slightest, just like the shrimp, or if you find that creatures do change, it's not an evolution, it's a devolution. Case in point, the megalodon shark, which is identical in every way to the great white shark, bar one factor. It's an awful lot bigger, right? And that's a case of creatures not evolving. It's going from good to bad to worse. It's devolving. We've done programs before where we've talked about things like the ginkgo leaves. In the Jurassic period, supposedly nearly 200 million years old, they supposedly had these long fronds. And today they're stumpy little leaves. Yeah, they've changed, but they've not evolved. They've gone from good to bad to worse. Now, I don't believe they're 200 million years old, but the point is it doesn't matter how old you make them. They're still living fossils. And even though there's change, it's minor change, and it's change that is going downhill. The third thing that we find, creatures go extinct, like, as far as we can tell, the dinosaurs. And not one of those three things is any help to evolution, but it fits in perfectly with what we would expect to find if creation was true. Because if you have not changed in 155, in 450, in some of the oldest living fossils are supposed to be over 1 billion years old. And if you haven't changed in 1 billion years, you're not likely to evolve anytime soon. But it does make sense if God told you to reproduce after your own kind. If you have changed, but you've not evolved, you've devolved, not only are you not evolving, you're going the wrong way, but it's what we would expect to find if the world has gone from good to bad to worse, just like the Bible says it has. From created perfection to fallen world to, hey, created again in God's image in the new heavens and new earth. That's something that we can look forward to. And the third option is extinction. And you realize that if you are extinct, it doesn't matter how hard you try, you're never going to evolve, you're now dead. And so not one of those three things is any help to evolution, but all three of those things is exactly what we'd expect to find if creation was indeed true. So that's my little section there. Anybody got any comments?
Yeah, if you're going to try and eat that shrimp in the rock, Glenn, you need to make sure you've got a toothpick.
We're going to eat shrimp this week. Joe's asked for a shrimp and crab boil.
I got to experience a Louisiana shrimp boil last year, and they made a big mistake in introducing me to that.
Yeah, I'm very pleased that prawns haven't evolved because I really like them. They might have evolved into something inedible.
I'm also grateful for the promise that we got at the end of the flood that all things are good for eating.
Although, you speak about devolving, and this you might address some with the DNA, because we're finding more and more people like my daughter who used to be able to eat shrimp, but now she has to carry an EpiPen if she even gets exposed to something that's been cooked with shrimp.
Well, that's a classic case of how things are going downhill, which is actually what we see in biology. We don't see evolution as a theory where things are supposed to have gone from simple to complex, where you're getting more and more complex things adding up. But what we're seeing is that we're losing things in our individual bodies, but also in the whole biological world. So again, you've got two very opposite theories about how the world began and its history since then. And we need to take that into account as well. It's not just origins, it's also what's happened in between. And as Joseph said, if you believe the Bible and then apply that to the day-to-day world, it's good to bad to worse. It's complex to simple, the very opposite of evolution. Or in biology, an easy way to remember is design degeneration. So that when you look at biological systems, you see lots of design. And in fact, the whole modern engineering process of biomimetics is actually based on that, where engineers, people who use nuts and bolts and structural things like that, they go out and they actually look at biological, soft, squashy stuff, biology, and use that to design things. Now, the fact that they do that is evidence that there had to be original design in the first place. It takes clever engineers who have got brains, who have got knowledge already built in, and they use systems like computers and machinery and things like that have been deliberately built in order to design things that work on biological systems. So we see design, but we do see things going wrong. So your example of the increase in allergies, because our bodies are losing things, they're not gaining things. I'd love it if bodies gained things, particularly as I'm getting on in years, but the reality is exactly the opposite. And we see that in the biological world as well. Anyway, we need to move on, but we will talk about that a little bit later on in terms of DNA. What will we?
Can I just say something there, Diane? I like to tell my kids that they're more mutated than I am.
That's
important.
true. Actually, every generation adds some mutations, and over the last few years, now that we can do whole genome studies, so that we can actually go from one generation to the next, we've had to admit every generation adds new mutations.
Good stuff.
I just don't talk to my dad about it.
Yes.
Does that mean you have a bigger brain than them, and the brain's shrunk if they've devolved?
No, it means when our moms and dad called us a degenerate, they were right.
Does that give us an excuse to call up Mr. Jenner? I'm not sure we'll go around that. Anyway, so where are we up to next week?
Anyway, yeah. Well, I was just thinking that going back to the eating of the shrimp thing was that we could be looking forward to in the new heaven and new earth all of these things coming back. So yeah, I'm looking forward to eating ammonites and orthoceras. I know they probably taste just like our squids, I guess, but yeah, definitely a nice big hunk steak from a Tyrannosaurus Rex would be nice.
I don't know. We're going back to being fully vegetarian. Mind you, the guys in my Bible study, we talked about that one night about what we would eat in the new heavens and new earth, and one of the guys said, "Oh, I do hope they have a bacon flavored tree," and one of the other guys said, "Yes, and I want a barbecued steak flavored tree if we're going to go back to being fully vegetarian."
Yeah. Maybe not eating them, or just enjoy playing with the dinosaurs. Right. Okay. Well, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, Joe, Diane is up next with, as you talk, Diane, about DNA. So it's over to you.
Yes, in fact, DNA is a classic example of design followed by degeneration, because DNA is a code. Now, codes actually arise from people's minds. If you've ever written a code or read a code, you need a mind to actually create the code and a mind to read it. And that's what we found with DNA. And in fact, it is called genetic code for a good reason. But we've also found that it's starting to fall to pieces, and that's what mutations are. Now, the standard theory of evolution is that somehow mutations build things, but when we study mutations, all we find is that they take things away. They either muddle the information, and an analogy for that is if you've ever made typographical errors, or if you've ever read something that's got typographical errors, sometimes it might change one word into another meaningful word, but it doesn't add to the overall meaning of the passage. So mutations are a bit like typographical errors, but most of the time they just garble the information. So we have design followed by degeneration, even at the very basis of life with DNA. Now, there's been an interesting piece of history since we've been doing whole genome studies. If you are old enough to remember when the first human genome came out, now that was around the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, when they first did the whole human genome. One of the headlines that came out was, "Oh, the human genome is full of junk," but then we've been evolving for millions of years, so it's not surprising there's a whole lot of leftover junk. Now, what they meant was that there is a lot of DNA in the human genome that at that time could not be ascribed to specific genes, or what we knew of as genes for proteins, which are the molecules of structure and function in biological systems. And so the term junk DNA entered the language, and it sort of stuck. But however, junk DNA has now been that term has been junked in the professional literature. Because we have now studied the human genome a lot more closely. We've studied the genome of other living things, and we've found out that the DNA that we cannot ascribe to coding for particular proteins is absolutely essential to life. And they've really now decided that, in fact, most of the DNA there is part of a giant sort of master control system that switches the other genes on and off. In fact, the gene regulators are just as important as the genes for structural and functional proteins. So if you looked at the human genome from a creation point of view, you would say, all right, nothing in there is meant to be useless. If we don't understand what something does, well, then what we should do is just do some more research. Now, we might have to wait until there's been an improvement in technology in order to find out what something does. But don't write anything off if you don't understand it. In fact, that's how science has worked through the centuries. Human curiosity has prevailed. And if we go back in history, another example of two mindsets, that one creation-based and one sort of evolution-based, is the whole sense of vestigial organs. Mm-hmm. People looked at the human body, they looked at animal bodies and said, oh, well, we have these little pieces of tissue. We don't know what they do. They must be evolutionary leftovers, so we'll write them off. And a lot of essential human organs, like the pituitary gland and the various other important parts of the immune system, were just written off as being junk. But then we developed more and more better technology for studying things, and human curiosity just prevailed. Fortunately, people looked at these things a little bit more closely and they discovered what they do. Now, had they been thinking with a creation mindset, we wouldn't be surprised at that, because we think, well, this is obviously meant to be there. We don't know what it does, but we will do some more research and find out, and we might have to develop some better technology to study it. So in fact, creation is a much better basis for science, because you start with the mindset, whatever we see in the real world has to be there for a purpose, or can be explained by what has happened in the real world ever since it started. And yes, we know it started out very good from what we are told in Genesis, but it's definitely gone downhill. So if we look at biological systems, whether you're looking at an entire creature, whether you're looking at its biochemistry, or whether you're out in the big wide world and looking at the ecology, you will see design followed by degeneration, because we are told the world started out very good, but it has fallen, and so it's been affected by human sin and by God's judgment. So if you have that mindset and look at the real world, it does explain things much better than the whole idea of things starting out simple and there being added to it and a whole lot of junk being created randomly on the way. Now, some of the others, if we can come back to us, some of the others might have some examples that they've come across in their own studies and their own experiences.
I still have my little finger, but I remember the teachers telling me in my lifetime we'll see people without little fingers. We don't need them, so we will evolve to not having little fingers.
I've not heard that.
Yes, I remember that.
Well, actually, the little finger is so important. It actually has some of its own little muscles in the hand that the other fingers don't have. So I don't know where that idea came from.
Organ.
I'm thinking that thumbs will have to evolve smaller so we can. My thumbs are way too fat.
Maybe we can evolve an extra thumb, a typing thumb, just so we can grip the phone properly, and one comes out of the wrist or something. And
yeah, I was just thinking that was obviously before they realised, in touch typing, it's really quite vital, that little finger.
Absolutely.
When you touch typing. Yeah.
Have we got any serious ones?
Oh, this teacher was serious. That was one of the many things that we would not need, would lose. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I've heard. I haven't seen the little finger used as an example, but I have heard that theory that human beings would actually lose a lot of their features, because we spend more of our time just sitting around talking and writing, and rather than having to go out hunting for mammoths and things like that.
Well, I've got an example coming up in Creation Headlines a little bit later, but one that I've raised before is the seahorse pipefish link. Two similar animals, but very different to look at. And we've got to be careful, not too dogmatic in these things as well. But the pipefish is known to have a mutated growth gene that causes it to keep extending in a long way. So it loses the bent head of the seahorse and becomes a straighter sort of creature. And it's lost a lot of other things as well when you compare it to a seahorse. But the evolutionary idea is that seahorses evolved out of pipefish. So all the gains in information with pregnancy, with the other things that seahorses have got, including its armour, have actually evolved from a pipefish, whereas the creation mindset is that we look at it in the opposite way. No, the seahorse is closer to the original created kind, and there's bits and pieces that have been lost off it. And one of the examples I like to use is when we use our Lego building blocks and we have a completed Lego structure, you can still take bits off it, off that structure, and still identify it until it comes to a certain point where it's no longer identifiable. And that's the same with living creatures. You've got the original created creature with all its complexity. There's little bits that can change and degenerate until it gets to a point where that creature can no longer function and can't survive in the environment in which it lives. So that's a way to look at the differences, the blocks coming together of their own accord into that complexity, or an original design that's losing bits and pieces off it to a certain point where it can no longer survive.
Yes, and we need to look at the real world. That's how the real world works. We don't see things coming together and gaining new information out of nothing. Whereas we do see things falling to pieces. We battle with that all the time, not just in our bodies, but in the world around us.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right, well, we're moving on. We'll be there's quite a few questions coming in and some thank yous to do. We'll do that in a few minutes, but it's over to Craig for our next item.
Okay, Steve, have you got my slides there, which I sent through?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the prediction, I suppose you'd call it, in a way that the Bible teaches us that Babel is the center of civilization. It's the first city that's mentioned in the Bible post-flood, and that's from where all people then dispersed. And the key verse that I've got for this is in Genesis 9. I mean, there's a number of passages you could look at, but this one sort of summarizes it well, I think, that the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Ham being the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. So that's our foundation. That's what we're basing our knowledge on, these sorts of passages in the scriptures. If that's true, what would you expect? And I've pulled out a number of sub predictions that you might just some. There's probably a whole bunch more that you could pull out as well. But here's some sub predictions that would flow from that. That all languages have their origin at Babel, and there'll be a core set of languages that have no linguistic connection at their earliest origin. And that's simply because it was a spiritual event where God separated the languages apparently in an instant, and they can no longer talk together, these different groups. So there's a definite split, and we'll have a brief look at that in a moment. We'd also expect there'd be similar stories of early history found in early cultures, and we would also expect from the biblical picture that man was, as an individual, more intelligent than now, and this is part of that degeneration that we're looking at. And I guess we get that when we look at things we can't even explain properly today, like how did they build the pyramids, Machu Picchu, and all those sorts of incredible things that we see in early civilization. Now, the evolutionary prediction, of course, is that mankind evolved from apes out of Africa over long periods of time. And given that there's such vast ages applied to this, it ought to be evident that human groups appeared and sprung up in multiple areas, in different civilizations, and so on altogether. And there's no strong evidence of that. We usually see with Neanderthals and all the rest of it is the storytelling that goes about it. But because they're not written cultures, the cultures with writing, we can't be as certain as we can with the cultures that we've got coming out of Babel that are cultures with written languages. Actually, before I get to that, let's look at a few evidences that support the Babel dispersal. Firstly, go online. I did this myself. Go online and type in cradle of civilization and see what comes up. And you'll find over and over again that it is the Mesopotamian region that answers this question. What is the cradle of civilization? It's something that even secular knowledge accepts, that most cultures seem to be linked in some way to the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian region. And this helps explain as well why so many cultures have flood stories. I mean, it was such a major event, and it would have been imprinted on the minds of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and they would have told their kids, and those stories would have flowed from there. Of course, there's some changes, but these flood stories around the world all have similar elements to them, including things like judgment on wicked men, the gods judging wicked men. There's a boat or a canoe or a raft or something involved, often with animals, and often highlighting that there's a righteous man and woman on that boat. There's animals involved, there's rainbows involved. And some of these disparate cultures even have details such as a raven or a bird being involved towards the end of the flood. So how can these be explained from cultures that are in different continents now, unless they've all come from the same source? There's other things that are inexplicable as well if they didn't come from the same sort of location. For example, the star constellation meanings, and we've reported on this before, but it's very powerful. As when I went to a cosmology center on the road trip I did last year, and the cosmologist that was on site said, we just can't explain how the American Indians and Australian Aboriginals have the same stories for some of the constellations. And I expressed to him the idea that they came out of Babel, to which he was very interested to hear that. But obviously with his worldview, that was difficult to accept overall. But there's a lot of other similar technologies as well that we see, and in far-flung cultures. And I think of even bows and arrows, but one that we've been talking about quite a bit recently is boomerangs. And the Aboriginals are not the only place in the world, in Australia, that have got these tools. And John has shown them from the Sudan, from Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt, in Poland, I believe they're there as well. And even to this day, they're used in the subcontinent in India. So we see these sorts of things. But a really interesting one that I came across quite recently was a vase in Bolivia was found. A big sort of ceramic vase was found near Lake Titicaca, I think it is, about 3,800 meters above sea level in Bolivia. And it was found on a farm being used as a drinking trough. It's known now as the Fuente Magna. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but the Fuente Magna. And it was found by people. It's now in a museum. It was found to have engravings very similar to the cuneiform writing from ancient Sumer. And no one knows how it's possible that this ceramic vase with that similar sort of writing to the Babylonian region could end up 3,800 meters up a mountain in Bolivia, given that those languages have been gone since about the 1st century AD. So an understanding of the Bible helps to understand these connections a lot better. The fact that people were smarter than we even accept now. They didn't come from caves and Neanderthals that were brainless or anything like that. They were smart from the beginning. Noah could build an ocean liner and fill it with animals, keep them alive for a year. People could then build pyramids and so on. They could make pottery. They could write, and they dispersed and may well have even gone on ocean voyages that we are completely unaware of in the modern era, way back when cuneiform writing was commonly used. Now, there's also the linguistic connection, and here's some examples of the major language families. So the sub-prediction that we've got is that there ought to be some very identifiable language groups that can't be connected, and that is in fact what we find. There's different ideas as to what the exact family groupings or core groups, I think they call them the proto-language, is the base language from which others have evolved, if you like. Others have grown out of, and they're some of the major ones that are seen on Earth today. The Indo-European group being perhaps the most widely used language around the world, other than the Chinese Sino-Tibetan group. Of course, there's a lot of Chinese people speaking Mandarin as well, but the Indo-European is probably the most commonly used, and there's a few other groups there for you to have a look at. So there's an estimated 7,000 languages currently used on Earth today, but they're grouped down into about 100 language families, again, depending on who you're talking to. So there's a number of predictions. I think that's it. If you want to come back to us, and maybe others have got comments on that. But the spread of ancient civilizations certainly fits with what we see in the Bible. Obviously, a lot of people rely on other things to say that the Aboriginals have been here for 65,000 years or whatever. But these are groups that have no written language, no solid record. This is a storytelling that's been built upon an evolutionary worldview that's very hard to support with good evidence.
One of the things I found interesting, Craig, was with these different people groups, that there's over 300 of them that have a story of the flood. And what I found really interesting was that many of these, separated by long distances, have a name for Noah's wife, which the Bible doesn't even record, and yet they're having similar, some of them just right on, spot on, the same name for Noah's wife. How would they know that unless they all disperse together? So.
Yeah, the Hawaiians have got Nu'u and the Chinese Nuwa. So, I mean, phonetically, there's a very similar Tanoa, aren't they? So,
All right, is it break time, Steve?
Question and answers.
Yeah, we'll do some thank yous. We thank you very much for some donations that have come in. Doki Doki, thank you very much for your $1.49 and the box of popcorn, which we'd love to enjoy. But and then who have we got? We've got Who little old me? Thank you very much for the 10 Australian dollars. Thank you very much with the pair. And then Neil, thank you very much for your £10. Greetings to the team. Great. We're all doing well. Thank you very much for your donations. They're very much appreciated. Thank you. We have got some questions. Sorry?
There was a comment there about us being all old. Did I read that right?
No, I hope you are all okay.
I hope you are all okay.
I hope you're all
yes,
because there's an exclamation mark.
I'm a bit far away from the computer screen. I can read that. Right. Yes, we're okay.
Good. Good. We got a couple of questions. They're not hugely, they're linked, but they're not exactly on what we've been talking about. But James asks, perhaps one of the team could share or could explain how the monarch butterfly points to a designer. Who would like to give a stab at that?
Well, what aspect of the monarch butterfly are we referring to? When people have looked at butterfly wings, actually, they find a lovely example of design about how genes interact to get those patterns. In terms of butterfly life cycles, like all insect life cycles, you've got a very complex life cycle, and it only works if all of the components are there. So you imagine the difference between the larva, which is the caterpillar, and in the case of butterflies, and the adult. There's a huge number of genes that have to be switched on in order to transition from one to the other. So there's good example of design just in the whole life cycle. Is it to do with the migration as well?
James has just put up a statement, Methuselah stage. I'm not sure if that's a tip towards what he's asking about. I don't know.
I think just generally, as Diane has pointed out, there's so many different aspects. And I think in terms of the topic, what we're speaking about tonight, we would expect to find complexity even in the things which are considered simple. And so you might think that a butterfly is not as complex as, an orangutan or a human or something like that. But the reality is there is complexity even down into the simplest forms of life. So much so to the point that mankind has never been able to come close to replicating it, which, just tells you how complex it is.
Well, it's quite complex, and it goes from a caterpillar into a cocoon into a butterfly. That's
a worm to soup to a flying creature.
Yeah.
Yes, and you've got to get that right within one generation, otherwise you're extinct.
Yeah. Just the complexity of flight and the design of the wings and the muscles to control them. That's amazing.
Yes, we've got quite a few examples of design in butterflies in our fact file.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Who little on me says, if platypus lay eggs, what evidence exists that dinosaurs are reptiles, not mammals?
Well, mammals are not specifically defined over eggs. It's more to do with the warm-blooded and hair and fur. And so you have placental mammals, or you have marsupial mammals, and then you have the platypus, and the echidna, which are somewhere that don't quite fit, but we stick them in that category anyway because of the warm-bloodedness and because of the hair. Right? The definition of reptiles is cold-blooded with scales, and eggs is certainly one of the definitions. But like most things in biology, you can never go with just a singular definition because you will get, basically a category for every single creature that's ever lived. So you have to sort of widen the pot, so to speak, I've always said in the sort of, you've got your 5 kingdoms, your protozoa is kind of the dustbin category. If it doesn't fit in the other 4, you kind of lob it in there and hope for the best because it doesn't quite fit anywhere. You have protozoa that consume, you have protozoa that produce, and you have protozoa that do both. And you've got to remember, these are definitions, by the way, which we have put onto them.
Yes.
Okay, so we have defined reptiles as being cold-blooded with scaly skins and lay eggs, and we put everything into that category. We then categorize a step further because we say there are such things as archosaurs, which include the crocodilians, right, your crocodiles and your alligators and the like, and they include the dinosaurs. But are crocodiles related to dinosaurs? Well, many dinosaurs are not even related to each other because God didn't create according to kingdom or according to order or according to class or any of the things that we have put on them. God created according to kind, and he is the one who gets to define what a kind is. Now, we've tried to make sense of that, and in particular, the guy who invented our classification system, Carl Linnaeus, he took the concept of kind and built it into his classification system, and the Latin word for kind, which he found in his Bible, is genus. And it is true, many times genus is going to correspond with what a created kind is. But you've got to remember, it's our categories. So it usually, a kind definition usually sits somewhere between family and genus. It certainly doesn't sit at species because we don't even have a proper definition for a species. And much beyond that, higher up, you're just basically making categories that we have defined to put animals in.
And family was added. He didn't have that in his original system, classification system. So yeah, kinds may be more associated with family, but that's not the system that he developed.
Yeah.
He intended it to be by genus.
It just got to the point where he'd kind of slightly underestimated quite the complexity that there is in the living world and just how much diversity there can be even within a kind.
We have got a follow-up question, and time is moving on, so maybe just very quickly, what of hyenas?
As in, which category do they go in?
I guess so.
I suspect there is quite a variety of hyenas, and they are very, very unique, not just in their, obviously they're mammals, but particularly in the way that they reproduce is very, very unique. Now, it was interesting because I was actually thinking through hyenas just a couple of days ago because I want to do some research into, I won't go into detail now, but if you want a mind-bending exercise, look up how hyenas reproduce. And I would be very interested in seeing whether the way that they reproduce is a design or whether it is a broken design, because it's rather interesting. But anyway, I'll have to look into that a bit deeper and see. I suspect there are a variety of hyenas, and I suspect that they are their own kind. You get quite a wide variety of hyenas in the hyena family.
Okay, thanks, Joe. We need to move on, but if there are any other questions, if we have time at the end, we will bring those questions too. But it is time for the headlines. Craig is going to be bringing the headlines to us tonight. So let's bring Craig up, and it's time for the headlines.
Welcome to Creation Headlines this week. And first up, in a recent study reported in the journal Nature Geoscience, researchers from the University of Bristol have calculated that all 5 continents, excluding Antarctica, will merge to form a supercontinent called Pangaea Ultima. They calculate that the huge landmass will cause CO2 levels to rise and temperatures will range between 40 and 70 degrees Celsius or more, leading to unlivable conditions that will wipe out humanity and many other creatures. But before people run screaming in panic out into the streets, this event is expected to occur in 250 million years' time. I guess the authors are therefore at no real risk of criticism. Who's going to prove them wrong? Of course, they warned that humanity could already be wiped out due to human-induced climate change in the immediate future. But it's sad when you don't really believe in the Creator God, who holds the whole world in his hands and has already told us the future of the planet. It is going to be consumed in a fire well before 250 million years are up. But again, there's no need to go screaming out into the streets. he's also provided us an opportunity to participate in the new heavens and earth that will never pass away. So get on board today through Jesus Christ. Now, in our next story, in a controversial project trying to bring back woolly mammoths, scientists have altered 7 genes in mice to produce woolly mice. They believe this to be the first step in creating woolly mammoths through the Indian elephant. But other scientists are skeptical. One from the University of Montana stated that you may be able to alter the hair pattern of an Asian elephant or adapt it to the cold, but it's not bringing back a woolly mammoth. It's just changing an Asian elephant. It certainly raises some interesting questions like, should man be playing God like this? Or perhaps, in defense of the project, why not alter genes? Isn't that what mindless evolution is doing anyway? But what the project highlights is that man is really creating nothing new. The original creator did that, and that the loss of genes for woolly hair is going in the opposite direction to evolution. And one last question we need to ask on this is, if we generate a woolly mammoth again, will it still be scared of woolly mice? Now, finally, researchers can't see the truth of blind cave fish because, as if to prove the case that evolution really is about losing genes, researchers in China have discovered a previously unknown species of golden lion fish living in caves and suggest that their adaptations show evolution in action. Many cave fish have lost their eyes. Like other fish in these environments, these ones have done that as well, but they've also lost their scales. But this new fish that they found still has eyes, but has lost its scales, suggesting to scientists that they are still in the process of evolving. What no one seems to point out to them is that losing eyes or scales does not tell you where eyes or scales originally came from. It goes to show that any observation of change is considered evolution, and the changes that we always see are losses, mutations, or degradations of the original, and this is no help to evolution. And that's Creation Headlines for today.
Great, thanks very much, Craig. Does anyone have any comments or questions on those headlines that would like to share?
I can't understand why they want to bring back the woolly mammoth, because where do they think it's going to live? And because an animal that large would need, plenty of grass and vegetation to eat. But they're
not going to be happy to be put back in Siberia, are they?
No, not at the moment. But if they tried to reintroduce them into sort of warmer, more tropical regions, the woolly mammoth wouldn't be very happy being covered in woolly fur. And where would they put such a large animal for? Even these days, elephants are considered to be a hazard to human beings in some places and farmlands. They obviously haven't thought that through.
I like little old me's comment asking, were cavemen also blind? Well, you're going to bump your eyes too in a dark cave, aren't you?
Well, I suppose that's why they lit fires in caves, so that they could see. But going back to cavemen and your comments about human civilization, there's no evidence that cavemen were stupid. And in fact, Neanderthals had bigger brains than the modern day average, and they were extremely resourceful. And even the evolutionists admit that they must have had complex language because they worked together, they were sophisticated, and they were very clever in the way that they used their resources.
Great. We're moving on to the next segment. I think, Joe, it's back to you.
All right, this is both what would we expect to find if creation was true, as well as an actual prediction, or rather an action that a group of scientists did, which came from a place of a belief in young Earth creation. It is to do with this bone here, one crocodilian bone from Orton Pit in the UK, one hole where a sample was taken, where it was tested for soft tissue. Okay, quick background to soft tissue inside dinosaur bones. When we talk about the soft tissue in this context, we're not just talking about soft material that has been preserved. In fact, wherever it's gone over there, when we had the starfish fossils earlier, that's technically fossil soft tissue. It is soft, squidgy stuff, starfish, that has been preserved. We're not talking about that. The better technical term for it than soft tissue is the original biomaterials. In other words, we are talking about molecules, biomolecules, things like proteins, like collagen, that have been preserved and have endured inside the bone to be found today. That's what we're talking about. Now, biomaterials inside bone really was discovered by accident, because Mary Schweitzer, who first sort of gave the major report on it, dropped a bone. That's not good. These bones are quite fragile and quite important and quite valuable. So, oh well, we've dropped a bone, we've broken it, let's make the most of it, let's analyze the thing to death. What do you find inside? What appears to be the remains of red, soft material, things like blood cells. A few years later, she had to fight an enormous amount to get it shown to be actually what she believed it was. And a few years later, in 2007, the first major paper published in Science reported on these discoveries, including pictures of soft material that you can stretch and tease and all sorts. Now, this came from a place of disbelief, if you like, by many scientists who believe that it was impossible for soft tissue to last for millions of years. Now, I'm inclined to agree with them. In fact, everything we know about biomaterials says that they cannot last for millions of years. And collagen, which is now one of the most predominant biomaterials found inside ancient bone, the world expert on collagen basically says that there's no way it can last for more than 1 million years. I'd be inclined to believe it's a lot less than that, but I'm happy to go with 1 million years, especially when you're finding stuff like that in bones that are supposed to be 200 million years old, as is with this crocodile bone. Okay, where does the creationist prediction-y type of stuff comes in? Well, number one, what would we expect to find if the Earth was only a few thousand years old? And if there was a major global flood 4,500 years ago? Well, a major global flood would preserve bones very, very well indeed, in enormous volumes of sediment. Now, Glenn's mentioned some of the things about the sediment, and one of the things the sediment does is preserve bones. So we'd expect good levels of preservation. That's exactly what we would find. In good levels of preservation, you have a far higher chance of finding original biomolecules in bone for two reasons. Number one, it's very well preserved. Number two, it's not millions of years old. So we would actually expect to find soft tissue inside these bones, original biomaterials inside these bones, if the world was very young, and we do. What is specific about the prediction? Well, even though this biomaterial had been found, there was still a general belief that it should be extremely degraded. It should be, broken down. There should only be fragments of stuff in there, and there certainly shouldn't be whole proteins like collagen. Well, collagen was found, and you see a group that I am part of in the research world, out of the University of Liverpool. Many of us believe in a biblical creation, and because we believe in a biblical creation, we're coming from the perspective of believing that these bones were buried in Noah's flood, so will be very good, full of preservation. Secondly, they're not millions of years old, so there's every chance of not just finding original biomaterials, but finding biomaterials that are so well preserved, we'll be able to sequence them. Now, this prediction, if you like, the prediction that we'd be able to find biomaterials that could be sequenced, and we were able to sequence them, came from the belief in young Earth creation. It had never been attempted before. What did we do? We sequenced collagen, not just out of this bone here, but we actually sequenced it out of 4 other bones, one of which has been published, one of which is going to be published shortly. This is the short report that we did. You'll have to, you can get a copy of one of these online on our website. Lots of squiggles, look, which correspond to the results from mass spectrometry. But you'll find that not only are we able to find collagen, we were able to sequence it, which is not only what we would expect to find if the young Earth and Noah's flood was true. We also tested it because of our background and our beliefs in young Earth creation and Noah's flood. So yes, creationists do real science. Yes, this is proper published material in secular conferences and secular journals, and we are really coming along now with some of the work that is being done in this field. Finish there. Unless any comments?
No, just find it interesting that since Mary's paper, there's over 200 in refereed science journals, 200 papers that are finding soft tissue in bones. So it's well established.
But they don't. But they don't ask the question. Well, they don't come to the conclusion. Oh, well, maybe dinosaur bones aren't as old as we thought they were. Their immediate reaction is, well, we need to now find out how collagen could last 66 million years, and that is just absolute proof that your worldview drives your science. Because the most obvious question that you should ask is, well, maybe the dinosaur bones aren't as old as we thought they were. How could that be the case? And then they might go down the path of looking at a flood a few thousand years ago that buried them.
It's the same reason that they don't do carbon dating on bones, because there shouldn't be any carbon in there, so they don't even test for it. But every time it's been tested, that they find, well, these bones are, 10, 20,000 years old according to carbon dating, which I don't believe that they're even that old because of all the problems with carbon dating. But they're sitting in a layer that's over 65 million years old. Well, one of the two has got to be right, but they don't test for carbon because they just presume. Well, evolution has said that they died out 65 million years ago.
Yeah, the worldview drives the ages, not the science.
Yes,
That's it. Good.
We are going to move to a slightly different topic right now, Glenn. I think we're going to go a bit more out of this world, or maybe not.
Yes,
you explain.
Yes. So one of the things, if evolution is true, then life should have self-generated on other planets, even though we've tested that theory on our planet over and over and over again since the 1950s. And if there's one thing that has been absolutely proven in science, is that life cannot self-generate. But if there's life on this planet and there are billions of other planets, then there surely is life somewhere else. There ought to be life on some other planet. So that's what we're going to look at. Well, what does the Bible say? I'm going to take it from the biblical perspective. God gave us his notes and dictated them face to face to Moses, who recorded day one. He created time when he created space and matter, and then he created light. Day two, he created an expanse that separated the waters. Day three, well, he didn't create soil that was already there. It just said it appeared. But he did create plants. Day four, he created the sun, moon, stars, the galaxies. Day five, he created sea creatures and birds. Day six, he created land creatures and mankind in his image, and then he rested. Oh, did you miss what was not there? He didn't say he created life on other planets. He didn't say, and I created aliens on other planets. So that's missing. Then you got to look at the effect of the curse. The curse came about because man sinned, and it was through one man that sin entered the world, and death through sin. And the Bible says the whole creation is affected by this curse from sin. So the whole creation is suffering because of man's sin. So the poor alien, if he was such a thing, they would be suffering, no fault of their own. They didn't sin, but yet there would be death, and they would be destroyed because of what man did. Now, for man, God sent his own son to die for us on the cross. Well, would that mean that he's got to go to every planet that's got life and die? Well, not according to the scriptures. It says that He died once for all, that Christ suffered once for sins. He's not going to be going to all these other planets. So again, the aliens would be just out of luck. Does that sound very good, like a loving God? So there's no mention of ETs. There's no provision for ETs in the Bible. That's according to the Bible. There are no other life forms. Well, what do the observations say? Well, our governments have spent billions looking for life. There's the SETI program that was getting 10 million a year, and this has been going on for over 50 years. And this is just one of many, many programs. And so they've been looking for, sending satellites out into space, looking for life. And this is what they found. It's funny, but they haven't found any life, any even indication of life. And then you got to take into account that, okay, space travel, it is really interesting. I love the science fiction movies, but they are science fiction because they defy the laws of physics. Just the amount of force that it would take to come anywhere close to the speed of light. Here I've got it, 98 atomic bombs to propel a little tiny ball at 50% the speed of light. And if you could get to 50% of the speed of light, it'd take you 4 million years to reach the nearest galaxy. There's another thing that we know from science is that space travel defies the laws of physics. So what do we know from science? Observations have failed to find life on other planets. Intergalactic travel is just physically and biologically impossible. That's why they call it science fiction. So the observations show that the Bible is true. There is not life, not intelligent life on other planets. So with that, we can go back to the panel. If anybody's got anything else to say.
Well, if you look at the history of us sending space probes to Mars, they've landed so many things on Mars for the last few decades. And if you go back and look at the science reports, we go around this cycle where we've found evidence for water on Mars because they have the mindset if there's water, there has to be life, because the Earth is full of water and it's full of life. Or we found evidence of microbes on Mars. And then a few months later, someone will say, oh, no, this was just caused by water flow or by airflow or wind or something like that. And we've been round this cycle so many times. And there was a recent one that just came out within the last couple of weeks about we found these spotted rocks on Mars. They might be from microbial colonies where microbes grow in little clumps. And I suspect that in a few months' time, they'll decide, oh, these spotted rocks actually have some sort of chemical origin. We've been around that cycle so many times that we no longer report that in our fact file. But if you go back through it, you'll find a few of these things of someone's claimed, oh, yes, we found water on Mars, we found flowing water. And then a few months later, somebody else has written, oh, no, this was just something that was caused by the wind or by some geological process or something like that. It's happened so often. People are just clinging on with their fingernails to, we've got to find life on Mars. Let alone further away in the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and things like that.
I used to watch My Favorite Martian.
Yes, I'm old enough to remember that.
That doesn't make it true or make it real, but it seems so real the way you watch it on TV.
my illusions.
Yeah. So some of the best evidences for water on Mars is the erosional features. Particularly some of the box canyon type features that look like they would be formed by seepage, but they're still looking for that water. Haven't found it, but they have erosional features. But we also know that you can get sediment transport and erosion and movement without water.
Mm.
So, anyway.
All right, well, we've got one more segment left, and then Diane's going to give some some comments to finish, but it's over to Craig for the final bit.
Yeah, well, I haven't got a lot on this, but the Ice Age was a subject that we thought we might just briefly raise, because I always remember Joseph saying, when he asked one of his lecturers, and you can correct me on this, Joe, but you asked one of your lecturers, where did the Ice Age come from? And they responded, well, when you find out, let me know.
Yeah.
You know, I use that commonly around, because I think it's a great one, that the geologists, the universities, they don't know how the ice ages could arise. Scientifically, it seems impossible, yet they have this long age idea of the world. So therefore, we've had hundreds of thousands of years of ice and snow, etc., in the past. Whereas the biblical response to that is, well, of course, we haven't had that length of time, but there's plenty of evidence there has and is ice and snow. So what would generate it? Well, the biblical flood model answers that beautifully, because you've got all the conditions that you need to produce catastrophic amounts of ice and snow. You've got warm oceans, and you've got a cold atmosphere with all the volcanic ash and debris and steam in the atmosphere is going to block the sun out a bit. And so the creation models are that within 50 to 100 years post-flood, we have the ice and snow starting to fall dramatically. And we've done shows on that, so you can go back and look at that. And that explains a lot of things, the sudden ocean drop, the pathways across between continents, for example, it's just escaped my mind, but between Russia there and Alaska, through to Tasmania, through to Australia and other places like that, all being linked up. Just very quickly recap, when I was doing my research, I came across a paper on plant distribution in North America, and the struggle that this fairly well-known paper was coming to grips with how could all of the ground herbs spread across the North American continent after the last ice age maximum, which they believe was about 18,000 years ago, given that most of these herbaceous plants only have seed dispersals annually of less than half a metre, but they have to have travelled up to 2,000 miles or more northwest, south and east from the last ice age refugia in the southern USA, and they can't explain this with their seed dispersal capabilities. And I did seed dispersal studies as well as part of my research. We dropped herbaceous seeds down wind tunnels and saw what the wind might do to affect it, and it doesn't do anything. They basically drop like bricks. How even got a wallaby skin and was trying to attach do scientific experiments attaching different types of seeds to the skin, and just see if animals could cart them around, and not really. They wouldn't grip on very well at all. So
just a scientist's version of pin the tail on the donkey.
Yeah, it was good fun actually.
The seeds
I actually had an echidna wandering through the bush while I was doing the experiment, so I went and got a bunch of seeds and chased it and dropped it on it, just to see if it would cart it very far. But even an echidna, it's got the spines and fur, wouldn't catch the seeds. So, and this paper that I was looking at acknowledges that most of these seeds aren't going to be dispersed by wind or animals. So how is it possible that it happened? But as I looked at it, I thought, well, my worldview answers that problem, because the ice hasn't been there that long. The seeds are already in the ground. And once the ice went, it came quickly, it went, and we know that seeds can last in cold conditions for at least hundreds of years. Then once the ice retreated, the seeds simply germinated, and up they came and away they went again. So again, your worldview drives your science. Well, the worldview based on the biblical understanding that I have basically explains that straight away, and I don't think evolution will ever explain how those seeds could disperse across the North American continent in 18,000 years. Do your maths. Half a metre a year times 18,000 is only about 9 kilometres. So and this is across hundreds of different species, not just one or two. So that's just another example of an understanding that we get from our underlying presumptions.
Yeah, in Antarctica, when there's places where the ice is melted and exposed the ground, and then plants will germinate. Well, seeds were already there. I see it in caves, the caves that then they've gone in and they've put in lights, and then all of a sudden you've got, plants that are starting to germinate around that. You see these kind of things. So did it disperse and go into there, or was it already in some of the dirt that they, packed in or found there, or, or it wasn't by dispersion? For most of these, it's existing. This is sedimentary rock laid down. And so you find all kinds of things.
I better go to Diane now
We've only got a couple of minutes yet.
Yep.
You're on the clock, Diane.
All right. Do we have any questions before we wrap up things?
There are a few questions, but I think they're a little bit off topic or a kind of diversion. So I think we'll keep those questions for a Q&A special or something.
Yeah, we'll save them up for a Q&A session. But yes, I think we just wanted to make the point at the end, particularly for young students who are afraid of going into studying science or contemplating a career in science because they think that they have to believe in evolution. In fact, you don't. Evolution is not useful in terms of practical day-to-day science, going out and doing science out in the real world. In fact, the worldview that everything started out good but is going downhill, in other words, design followed by degeneration, is a much more useful mindset for general biology. Now, you do have to be careful about where and when you express that idea, but biblical creation, and so that's not just origins, so it's looking at origins followed by the fall, followed by the flood, followed by the Tower of Babel and human dispersal. That history is a much better basis for everyday day-to-day science, because that depends, day-to-day science depends on the observations of the world in the present. So you do not need to believe in the theory of evolution in order to do science. Now, I know there's a famous quote that does the rounds, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Well, we'll look at the examples we've just discussed today, and that's only a tiny fraction of various aspects of science, whether it's human biology, whether it's geology, whether it's fossils, all of those things. The theory of evolution is no use to those things. But if you look at it from the point of view of a good world that's gone wrong, you can explain what we see out there in the real world. So I really want to encourage young students, if you are interested in science, go for it. In fact, we need Christians in the professions, in the trades, in business. And so if that is your thing, you don't need to believe in evolution. In fact, you will find that biblical creation followed by the rest of biblical history is a strong, solid basis for science, and you will do well because you will be starting with the truth embedded in your mind, and that truth will set you free. And so there is a good career in practical day-to-day science for you, if that is what you really want as a Christian. And so I would really encourage young students to think about that, and as they consider their future. And I think all of the others can probably add to that from their own experience and from the people that they've worked with.
Yeah. I think we forget sometimes that almost every field of science, including the biology fields of science, were started and founded by people who believed in the Bible and believed in the creation account. And I think it was the father of entomology who said it would be easier to take my skin away than take away my belief in God. Almost all these fields of biology. And you don't need to worry, too, about, yes, there's going to be a persecution against you if you believe in creation, but God's bigger than they are. And I know for me, yes, I faced persecution at a university, severe persecution, but God blessed me in my career. You can have a career and hold on to your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. People generally accept your belief system. I remember being halfway up a mountain in Tassie with an evolutionary soil scientist and seeing a bunch of sea creature fossils. This is quite a lot of years ago. And I said, how do you reckon these sea creatures got halfway up the mountain? And he said, let's just stick to the work we've got to do today, will we? He didn't want to talk about it. Not that I'd ever talk to him much about it at all.
All right.
Great. Well, time has gone. We've got to the end of our time, so we will be wrapping it up there. Just to say a few things. We've mentioned a lot of things, a lot of information, and we obviously have a lot of information on our website. So do check out our fact file, which is lots of more information about the stuff we believe and the research that's been done, and also Ask John Mackay. Ask site is a good place to go if you have more questions. Likelihood is that someone else has asked that already, so check that site out for questions, and do sign up to our newsletter as well to find out what we're doing in different places around the world in the ministry. Not just this YouTube channel, but many other events and activities around the world. So do come and sign up for that. So thank you all. There was one final question, which is, are you sticking to this time slot? And well, this has been a bit of a trial to switch times. And we had a bit of a brief meeting before this, and it looks like we might be sticking with this time. It seems to suit. We certainly have more viewers live this week than we've had in a few previous weeks where we tried a different time zone. So we probably will be sticking to this, but do watch for other videos that we might be doing in a hybrid sort of way. We might record some videos and we might put them out at different times, so keep an eye on that. But yeah, we might be sticking to this time zone, but just keep an eye out.
And just be aware, in America, the time change was a week ago, and
it's changing again in the UK.
So it'll adjust.
Yeah. So watch out for the notification in YouTube there. It'll hopefully have the right time. But thank you all those that have joined us, and thank you, team. It's been a good evening. And any final comments before we say goodbye?
I think so. We'll see you next week.
I predict we'll be here next week.
Yeah, we'll see you 9 p.m. next week. Well, sorry, this time, an hour and a half earlier. Next week. All right. God bless everyone.
Thanks.